I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone here, but as we look towards the return of Parliament in September, this country is heading into a political and constitutional storm. It's the Conservative Party's failure on Brexit and its lurch to the hard right that has provoked the crisis our country faces this autumn. After failing to negotiate a Brexit deal that would protect jobs and living standards, Boris Johnson's Tories are driving the country towards a no-deal cliff edge. Let's be very clear. We will do everything necessary to stop a disastrous no deal for which this government has no mandate. The government wants to use no deal to create a tax haven for the super rich on the shores of Europe and sign a sweetheart trade deal with Donald Trump. Not so much a no deal Brexit, more a Trump deal Brexit. Have no doubt, no deal would destroy people's jobs, push up food prices in our shops, and open our National Health Service to take over by US private healthcare corporations. I just remind them, our NHS is not for sale. But that seems to be a price that Boris Johnson is willing to pay, because it won't be him or the wealthy people that run the Tory party paying for it. It will be you. It will be us. It will be our people. Labour will do everything we can to protect people's livelihoods. We will work together with MPs from across Parliament to pull our country back from the brink. And I will bring a vote of no confidence in the government. And if we're successful, would seek to form a time-limited caretaker administration to avert no deal and call an immediate general election so the people can decide our country's future. If MPs are serious about stopping a no-deal crash-out, then they will vote down this reckless government, and it falls to the Leader of the Opposition to make sure no deal does not happen and the people decide their own future. That is our responsibility, and we gladly accept that responsibility and will carry it out in Parliament. Yeah. Labour believes the decision on how to resolve the Brexit crisis must go back to the people. And if there is a general election this autumn, Labour will commit to holding a public vote to give voters the final say with credible options on both sides, including the option to remain. 3 years of Tory failure on Brexit have caused opinions to harden to such a degree that I believe no outcome will now have legitimacy without the people's endorsement. But while Brexit is the framework of the crisis we face, the problems facing our country run much, much deeper. Much, much deeper than that. A general election triggered by the Tory Brexit crisis will be a crossroads for our country. It will be a once-in-a-generation chance for a real change of direction, potentially on the scale of 1945. Things cannot go on as they were before. The Conservatives and a very wealthy establishment that they so happily represent have failed our country. They've failed to protect living standards. They've savaged our public services. Look at the cuts that have happened at this very centre, and you all know all the other cuts that are happening all around you. They've deepened inequality in our society. Look at the incredible levels of wealth a small minority have, and then look at those sleeping on the streets because there's no home for them to go to. That is modern Britain. Inequality getting worse, and it's failed to keep us safe. Boris Johnson and his Tory cabinet have direct responsibility for the Tory decade of devastating damage to our communities and the very fabric of our society. However the Brexit crisis is resolved, the country faces a very fundamental choice. Labour offers a real change of direction that I believe the country needs. A radical programme, and I'm proud it's a radical programme, to rebuild and transform. And that radical programme will rebuild and transform communities and public services, to invest in green jobs and high-tech industries of the future, and to take action to tackle inequality and action to tackle the climate crisis that we all face. The Tories have lurched to the hard right. Johnson is Britain's Trump, as the US President himself declared, so it must be true. It cannot be said to be fake news. Fake populism and phony outsiders funded by hedge funds and bankers committed to protecting the vested interests of the richest and the elites, whilst at the same time, bizarrely, posing as some kind of anti-establishment movement. The Tories cannot be trusted to deliver on their quick fix promises, because their first priority, which has now been revealed, is tax cuts for the biggest corporations and the richest people in this country. You can't have it both ways. You can't be cutting tax for the very richest and then somehow assuming the money's going to be there to pay for the services for everybody else. We are very clear that we are prepared to raise tax for the very richest and the biggest corporations in order to rebalance our economy and our society and reduce the levels of inequality in Britain. The Tories can't be trusted to deliver for the majority because they will always look after their own. They've got form on this. Goes back a long way. Goes back centuries. Instead of fixing a failed system, they will turbocharge inequalities and insecurities and, of course, with that, climate destruction. Labour can be trusted to deliver the end to austerity, to take on the elites' and vested interests that are holding people back, and to transform our country, as we said in the general election, for the many, not the few. And we can be trusted to take radical steps necessary to protect our environment, provide hope, decent jobs, secure homes, opportunity for every nation and region to build a fairer country that works for all. Our country's been held back for too long by an establishment that the Tories represent. But together, we can take our future in our own hands and tackle the great challenges facing our country alongside Brexit. Inequality and an economy run for the richest, public services that have been stripped back and sold off, and the climate emergency threatening our children's future. Inequality holds us all back. It means the talent of millions of people is squandered. We don't have to be a country of food banks and rough sleepers at one end, while the super rich dodge taxes at the other. People have a choice. As I've said, Labour will raise tax for the richest and make sure they pay their share towards the common good. The Tories will cut tax for the richest. Labour will require the big multinational corporations to actually pay the tax they owe in this country. Tories will cut tax for big corporations. It's Labour that will get more money in your pocket rather than line the pockets of multi-millionaires. We'll introduce a real living wage of £10 an hour, including for young people who deserve equal pay for the equal work and contribution that they make to our society. The last time I looked, young people didn't get charged less in cafes and restaurants, didn't pay less in supermarkets, didn't pay less in rent. They have the same needs as older people, so why shouldn't they be paid fairly in order to live decently? But we do need to go further. The problem with an unfair economy isn't just the imbalance of wealth, it's the imbalance of power. So we'll give working people more power to win better wages and have security at work. So we'll put workers on company boards and give the workforce a 10% stake in large companies, paying a dividend of as much as £500 a year to each employee. And Labour won't tell people they have to work until they're 75. Before they get their pension, as Ian Duncan Smith's think tank has suggested. A policy that discriminates against working class people, especially those in manual jobs. And that's from the man who brought us universal credit and a number of other things. We're not having any of that. It's past time that we rewrote the rules of the economy to shift wealth and power from the small elite at the top to the hands of the majority. And that principle of empowering people doesn't just apply to the workforce. That's why we will bring rail, mail, water and the national grid into public ownership. So that the essential utilities people rely on are run by and for the public, not the shareholders. And we'll give tenants more power and security, including controlling rents so dodgy landlords can't rip them off. The insecurity of living in the private rented sector must be brought to an end. Many people suffer terrible stress because they don't know how long they'll be able to remain in the flat or house that they're renting. And when we talk about inequality, we aren't only talking about economics. We need a government that's seriously committed to tackling the entrenched inequalities faced by women and minority ethnic communities as well. And we will do that to end the gender pay gap and end the discrimination that too often exists where wages and jobs are concerned. The coming general election, I don't know when it's going to be, so don't ask me the date, but we're ready for it. The coming general election will be make or break for our public services. The new Prime Minister has been making some pre-election spending pledges over the past few weeks, which actually shows that Labour has won the argument that austerity damages our country and it was always a political choice. But it really does insult the intelligence of everyone to expect them to be grateful for a bit of extra money here and there with no confidence that it will actually be delivered or where it's coming from, when it's Boris Johnson and the Tories who ran our public services into the ground in the first place. And the arbitrary nature of the announcements made shows no understanding whatsoever of the depth of the problem facing the whole of our country. Take crime, which the Prime Minister is now trying to turn to his political advantage, with yet more promises to tackle what the Tories have failed to bring under control for a decade. In the 2017 election, Labour won the argument that Tory cuts to the police had made people unsafe, and we pledged to hire more officers. The Conservatives now conceded that we were right. But police cuts are not the only reason that violent crime has doubled. What the Tories won't address is the much wider impact of austerity. Think about it. The closed youth services around the country, under-resourced mental health care facilities, and the lack of funding for community mentoring. We take youth services very, very seriously indeed. They're the place that young people can go for their imagination, their recreation, their support, and get help when they need it, but also have time with friends and so on. It's part of growing up. It's part of being a community. But for too many young people all around the country, what do they see? A boarded-up youth centre, or in some cases, it's been sold off to somebody else. What message is that to the generation of 2019? That they grew up in an under-resourced, underfunded park where there was no youth service, no youth workers, and no facilities for them at all. What message is that? I take these things so seriously that we will make it compulsory for local government to deliver a youth service in the future. And we know the direct impact that rhetoric around immigration, crime and stop and search can have on the lives of those from minority communities. So Labour will rebuild our public services because we understand they are the glue that binds a society together. We'll restore pride in our National Health Service by funding it properly and end the sell-offs and privatisation that have come from the Tory and Lib Dem-inspired Health and Social Care Act. And we will create a national education service providing free learning from cradle to grave, including free school meals for all primary children, smaller class sizes for 5-, 6- and 7-year-olds, no tuition fees at university or college. And equal levels of support for those pursuing vocational education as well. They're equally important. Academic and vocational are equally valuable to our society. So who can the public trust to rebuild our services after a decade of Conservative austerity? Labour or the Tories? I leave that question to you. And on the issue that poses the greatest threat to our common future, the climate crisis, it's us, it's Labour that's shown real leadership. We ensured our Parliament was the first in the world to declare a climate emergency. I moved that motion on May the 1st to Parliament, and it was carried unopposed because the Tories didn't dare oppose it. But the declaration is obviously important. That's the first step. But that must be followed by radical and decisive action that can really only be delivered by a Labour government. It certainly won't come from the Tories, the party that scrapped the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon, effectively killed off onshore wind power projects, and is forcing fracking on local communities who oppose it. We have to turn the climate crisis into an opportunity to rebuild industry in this country with a green industrial revolution. That green industrial revolution will create 400,000 well-paid, high-skilled jobs in renewable energy and green technology, particularly in parts of the country that have never recovered from the decimation of our industrial base by Thatcher's government. Places like here in Corby, where the closure of the steelworks cost thousands and thousands of jobs. And there are many other towns and cities around the country that suffered to the same extent because of that headlong rush to closure and privatisation by the Thatcher government of the 1980s. Imagine if the Derbyshire and Yorkshire coalfields that once powered the nation became the new centres for green energy generation. Or if towns that used to build railway locomotives and railway carriages built the next generation of high-speed electric trains. Just imagine how it would feel for those communities to once again be the beating heart of our economy whilst reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and giving our young people a real future. The future is within our grasp. But I ask again, who do you trust to act on the climate emergency? Labour or the Tories, led by the current Prime Minister? We cannot afford more of the same, but even worse. The future could be fantastic. New technologies have the power to liberate us and help tackle the climate emergency. But for too many people, the future is frightening. Young people, uncertain what their future is, where they're going to live, what job they'll get, what training they'll get. Because the technological revolution that's happening around us has been used instead to benefit the wealthy while driving down pay and security for millions of other people. The next Labour government will take on those who really run our country, the bankers, the tax dodgers and the big polluters, so that the real wealth creators, the people of this country, can have the services, jobs and futures that they deserve. Because when Labour wins, we all win. The nurse wins, the pensioner wins, the student wins, the office worker wins, the engineer wins. We all win. The chaos and dislocation of a no deal Brexit is real, very real and threatening, as the government's leaked Operation Yellowhammer dossier makes clear. It makes it very clear, crystal clear, how bad things will get if there's a no deal exit on the 31st of October. That's why we will do everything we can to stop it. Then, after years of elite-driven austerity and neglect, we'll recharge our politics with a massive injection of democracy. Democracy brings health, brings justice, brings hope. Kicking out the big money interests and putting the people in the driving seat. We will rebuild our public services by taxing those at the top to properly fund them for everybody else. We'll drive up people's living standards by boosting pay, improving rights and running our utilities and economy in the interests of the millions, not the multi-millionaires. And we'll transform our communities with investment in every part of our country. The inequalities between north and south and east and west have got to be addressed. Breathing new life into our high streets by giving security to older people and hope and opportunities for younger people. This is an historic moment with the potential for real change to transform our country if we grasp that opportunity. Thank you.